Welcome to Learning is the New Working. I hope that you and your families and your teams are healthy, physically and mentally. And I'm really blown away that you're taking some time to still listen to the Learning is the New Working podcast. Thanks for doing that and for being my excuse to talk to some truly amazing people from my lockdown here in Seattle, where we're in week 6. As you know, we're experimenting with a new podcast season or a series of conversations that we've called From What If to What Now. And our aim is to learn from and share the innovation, best practices, helpful ideas and useful resources spawned by this abrupt shift in our work practices and to create some sense of community and connection in the post-COVID-19 world. We'll check in with prior guests and we'll meet some new leaders and practitioners to figure out how they're responding to what Josh Bersin has called the Big Reset. Just last week, we published an episode that I recorded in the fall with HLA Director Nick Kroeger, in which we learned, amongst other things, that the mission of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy was to enable individuals and organizations to better prepare to respond to disasters. Well, there's obviously never been a more important time, and likely never a bigger test of that mission. So, as I published last week, I reached out to Nick to get an update. And since the world is now divided into a pre- and post-COVID-19 era, I decided I'd ask him to come back today and share his observations on the impact of this pandemic on the broader humanitarian landscape, and also discuss how his team and his organization are responding to the challenges. Nick also brought along his Chief Innovation Officer, Atish Gonsalves, to talk about HLA's learning and innovation strategies and to get his take on the current crisis and how it's going to change the world of learning and digital learning. He's a fascinating guy, and this is a really great conversation. So thanks for listening in, and speak to you later.
I'm Nicolas Kroeger, and I'm the director of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy.
I'm Atish Gonsalves. I'm the Global Innovation Director and of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and also the founder of the Gamoteca platform.
Great. Well, welcome both. Welcome back, Nicola, and welcome, Atish. We've got a really interesting episode today. We are following hot on the heels of last week's release of a conversation I had with Nick back in December, I think, of 2019. And, in reaching out to him last week before we published it, he said, boy, a lot of things have happened, maybe a quick update. And this is exactly the purpose of this particular series that we're doing. So, Nicola, welcome back. And I'm really excited that you brought Atish along with you, somebody I've been meaning to have on the show for a long time. And so we're going to meet Atish as well. So both welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
I'd like to start with an update from Nicola, who, as I said, many of our listeners will have met just last week. But first, the most important question: how are you both, and how are your families doing?
Yeah, good. Good. I mean, considering all the circumstances, I realized that actually I'm spending quite a little more time with my kids, which is nice for them, I guess. Obviously, makes the whole kind of working environment a little bit more exciting. But there we go.
Yes, they may make a guest appearance. You never know. And Atish, you and your family and friends and work colleagues all well?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, no, doing well, and I think for me it's been really interesting to definitely reduce my air miles quite a lot. I was traveling quite a bit before, so very happy not to be traveling a lot and living actually quite locally at the moment. So. I think that maybe coming out of the silver lining of all of this might be that how we actually end up living more sustainably and more locally. But definitely interesting and challenging times, but I'm doing well.
Great, good. Well, let's talk about challenging times. Nicola, if we can, you find yourself in the position of being the spokesman for your industry in this conversation, I'm afraid. And I worry a lot about the sort of triple threat to the international aid industry. You've got, obviously, everybody constrained and stuck at home, which makes operations difficult. You've got the anticipation of a lot of damage that's going to be done as this virus hits the global south and places that are perhaps less prepared to deal with it than even us in the West. And then I know there's a lot of pressure on the sector because of revenues dropping. So can you give us a quick thumbnail sketch of what you see going on in the industry right now?
It is interesting times indeed. I mean, I see that in there's three dimensions, I think, to that. There is a sort of business as usual as it can be in the COVID context. So these are the 180 million people in need. These are the 860 million people, for example, who are affected, their livelihoods affected, impacted, or have been displaced. These are all the people, that are in Yemen, the 24 million people in need in Yemen, 16 million in the DRC. And those crises still remain, regardless of COVID or not, whether we hear about them or not, they are still there. So Afghanistan, the crisis there is not going away. The Syria crisis is not going away. Yemen is not going away. But as you say, they are dramatically impacted by how we can respond to those. So that's sort of the business as usual in terms of, it is still there. It's not going away, even if we don't hear about them. Then there is the sort of more COVID-19 specific, which is looking at kind of the health systems and how we can respond to the epidemic worldwide. So that's, looking at supporting countries that have either inexistent, non-existent, or very weak health systems. So, or countries or places like camps. How do you do social distancing in a camp? How do you do food distribution in a camp when you've got, usually you do a very, very big food distribution for a lot of people. How do you then organize yourself to actually maybe make it a, smaller distribution, smaller people, but more often? And how do you support a health system where, for example, you have only 12 intensive care beds for a population of 40 million? So it's trying to address all of those considerations. And I was reading this morning an article on the New York Times, for example, in Ecuador, where you've got bodies in the streets where people are not able to go to the hospitals, etc. So this is the direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you have what the humanitarians have is this fear of, okay, but what would happen if we then, in addition, are hit with new disasters? And for example, in Djibouti, there was a flood very recently. So obviously that ups the ante in terms of how can we respond to it. And as you mentioned, the key issues that people have are around how do you mobilize personnel on the ground when you can't actually fly in people. So you need to find people locally that are able to respond. You need also to make sure you've got the right local leadership in place. You need to make sure that the frontline humanitarians that are remaining and that are working there, or the people that are actually working or that are just responding because they happen to be there, their well-being is taken into account. There is quite a lot of disruptions to the global supply chain. So there is a lot of risks and threats that the humanitarian sector is currently seeing. And one of the things that we then need to figure out is how do we better respond to the needs in this completely shifting operating environment. So again, thinking maybe about building up your sort of local search capacities, thinking about, okay, how do I provide remote support to people, maybe in the form of coaching, in the form of mentoring? How do I continue to promote local organizations, support local organizations and their leadership? And finally, how do I provide the learning? Obviously, that's something that's the core for our purposes, but how do we provide learning to those people that are responding and may not necessarily have the support that they would have had otherwise?
Now, let's flip, if we can, a little bit to your role in all this and the Humanitarian Leadership Academy's role in all this. A lot of learning sites have seen a massive uptick in activity as people are stuck at home and perhaps laid off and taking the opportunity to reinvest themselves. That seems like a pattern that's emerging. A lot of interest in online learning. and we all know what's happened to Zoom. What usage patterns are you seeing on the Academy site?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have seen a very significant uptake in users over the past 2 months. So almost indeed consistent with the pandemic, how it spread, and we've had 10,000 users just in the month of March added to the number of users. We have just in the last 20 days about another 10,000 added. So we've got a total from when we talked, I think in December, I said we have about 115,000. That's right. And we currently have 180,000 on Kaya. And we're seeing quite a lot of uptake from a surge in demand in very specific countries. So for example, very interestingly, we have had quite a significant spike suddenly from people in Bangladesh. I think we've had literally over 2,000 registrations from Bangladesh over the past, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. So the demand is clearly there. And what is interesting as well is we can see that there is clearly a big demand for COVID-related content, but actually, interestingly, but actually intuitively, that makes sense as well. A lot of people are looking for meal program management, wellness and resilience, safeguarding. So content that we would always see as being kind of your business as usual, because people are still responding and still need tools to help them deliver better. So we have a quite a big spike in specifically COVID related content, but actually a lot of people are really reverting as well to some of the basics. Okay, what are the core humanitarian standards, international law, etc. So there is this kind of yes, there is all this new stuff that's coming through from in relation to COVID, but actually there is quite a lot that is still, I still need to do my job in a certain way. So I'm still kind of doing, I still need to understand how do I do project management. I still need to understand how to keep myself resilient over the course of delivering that, particularly in a context where in the context of COVID.
So your data is sort of giving me a sense that that these countries are sort of gearing up to deal with the consequences, and part of that is understanding specifics around COVID and how you operate in a COVID environment, and then, but also just going back to the core and going back to basics.
That's right, exactly.
Are humanitarian organizations hiring and bringing on volunteers at the moment?
Well, I think for the moment there is, for a lot of organizations, actually there is a sort of, because of, as you were saying at the very beginning, that kind of funding situation, there is actually, yes, a reliance more on volunteers than they would be on recruitments, because recruitments are being frozen because you don't know what the future holds for a lot of those organizations. So it's trying to bring in volunteers. But I think, as I mentioned in the previous episode, there is also this agency that individuals anyway have as they are, responding themselves to a disaster, because they are, in effect, humanitarians. They are living in their own community, which is affected by a disaster. And they have to respond in some shape or form, and they're not going to wait for someone to do that. So there is definitely reliance on, yes, we're going to try to bring in volunteers, and you can actually see that as well in the UK. I'm sure it's probably similar in the US as well, but suddenly, the NHS, the National Health Service, has basically got, I think the numbers was 750,000 people have volunteered to support the NHS. And I guess in those countries where disaster is a daily occurrence, where you've got protracted crisis, those people anyway are responding. So so that's what you're looking at. And for us, is figuring out how do we support those when we can't have access to them or help them directly face to face.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine in the UK who runs the training group for the Red Cross in the UK, and they've been working 24/7 for the last 11 weeks, helping bring on volunteers. It's a really super idea that came out in our last conversation, and seems so relevant today that, we're our humanity